Prezentu Skye Duncan, e cila është senior designer planifikimit urban në kuadër të departamentit të planifikimit qytetit në New York. Gjithashtu është edhe profesoresh në departamentin e arkitekturës edhe planifikimit urban në Columbia University. Me Skye aty bën një seri punëtorive në Prishtinë që kanë më shumë për detyrë me trajtu rrugët ekzistuese në anën estetike dhe fizike të tyre. Për më shumë rreth punës që bën Skye edhe departamenti i planifikimit urban në New York, kisha pasur që të mëftoj ata. Please, Skye.
Hi there. I'm Skye, as I think Beckham just introduced me. First of all, I wanted to say hello to everyone for coming, and a huge thank you to Beckham and the amazing team that he's put together for this fabulous week here in Pristina Architecture. I think it's an incredible city from what I've seen so far, with an amazing amount of potential, and I think a lot of agents of change sitting in this room. So that's incredibly exciting. What I'm going to speak to you today about, I think as Beckham said, I'm going to speak about some of the work that we've been doing at the Department of City Planning throughout the last decade. And I'm going to start by actually talking about how we shape cities through the lens of health and the built environment. This has kind of been one of the underlying themes of a lot of our work. I'm going to talk a bit about a document called Active Design Guidelines, about one called Shaping the Sidewalk Experience, and then talk about some of our aligning city policies, both at city planning and transportation agencies in New York City. I should say, I tend to speak a little fast, so I'm going to try and stay slow. I know my accent. While I work in New York City, I'm actually from New Zealand, so people in America have a hard time understanding me, so I'll try and enunciate clearly. But I can also make sure that this presentation is available online for anybody who wants it afterwards. So it's quite a lot of material I'm going to move through relatively quickly. But the idea is to help give a scope of the types of things we work on that can hopefully be inspiring and informative to you guys here in Pristina. So I wanted to start by showing a slide which really talks about the relationship of health and the built environment, and about the fact that 100 years ago, a lot of our cities around the world, but using the US as a case study, were really breeding grounds for diseases. They were overcrowded, they didn't have adequate sewage or garbage collection or water systems, and this actually meant that we had to deal with a lot of epidemics like TB and cholera and yellow fever. And what happened was the response to these health issues were actually through design and policy. So suddenly the city, through things like creating a sanitation department, through creating a water system to bring in fresh water from upstate, Central Park allowed a relief from the density and a place of green for mental health and to go out and be active. Cleaning the streets, tenement housing acts meant that new rules that you couldn't create dark airless buildings anymore where air couldn't circulate and light couldn't get into it. Of course, subway and public transit allowed density to shift out of the city a little bit, and zoning ordinance, which our department at Department of City Planning is in charge of, forced buildings to set back from the street line, so light and air had to get into the streets. It meant that the puddles of water where the mosquitoes had sat and breeded diseases suddenly would be able to dry up because sunlight could come in. And actually what was quite incredible was that through these design and policy responses, the disease epidemic rates dropped from almost 60% down to just over 10%. Now since then, it's only dropped another couple of percent to 9% more recently. And so that huge drop of almost 50% was actually before the widespread use of antibiotics, right? So it was through design and policy decisions that shaped our cities, not through the medication, right? It's not to say medication is not important when someone gets sick, but if we can stop people from getting sick in the first place, that's a pretty huge issue. So that was all very well and good for the 19th century, but in the 21st century we're dealing with very different diseases. And these are chronic diseases. Diseases of energy, what we often call them, obesity, diabetes, heart attacks, strokes and cancers. And what it is it's essentially an imbalance of our energy in and our energy out. So the way we've designed our lives now, our lifestyles, the food that we consume, the calories we consume, is not in balance with the things we do every day. So now we drive, we sit in front of computers, we take elevators instead of stairs. Our whole lifestyle has changed. And actually in the mid-1980s, the US Centre for Disease Control started collecting data about people's heights and weights to calculate what their BMI is. Now the funny thing to keep in mind with these is when you self-report, and this was a self-reported study, when you self-report these statistics, women tend to underreport their weights and men tend to overreport their heights. And so the issues are actually worse than what we're about to see here. So as you keep an eye on the numbers at the bottom here, but as we go through the years, we see no more white. We now have data everywhere. We see a new state of over 20% obesity. We see a new stat of over 25%. Now over 30%. And these same statistics and epidemics are following with diabetes, to the point now where 60% of adults and 40% of children in the United States are overweight or obese. Now, financially, today this costs around $150 billion a year in health treatment, health and medical costs. And if these trends continue, if we don't change, this is going to cost 6.5 times this per year, almost $1 trillion. And also, it's going to mean that 86% of our population will be overweight or obese. So today, 70% of our deaths are related to these chronic diseases. And we're not that highly evolved, right? Our genetics have not changed in this period of time. But the way we've designed our cities has, as I mentioned before. We now prioritize driving and moving on 4 wheels instead of using our feet. The way I love this photo here. These guys are going to the gym, but they're taking the escalator instead of taking the stairs. It's a great irony. And also, we've taken out opportunities for people to walk. And these are what we call goat trails or desire paths, where it's not provided as a walking space, but people want to walk, so they're going to walk. And so we should really pick up on these cues in our built environment. Now, what this has meant is that we realized quite a few years ago that this meant that we had to start collaborating, right? The health professionals and the doctors knew that these statistics were here. They knew that this was a very, very serious issue, not only for the United States, but for around the world. But they weren't the people who shaped the built environment. The architects and designers and transportation engineers were. And so this idea of a collaboration and finding synergies between the different disciplines was born. And this has been an ongoing effort with researchers, with policymakers, designers, and health practitioners as well. And so in about 9 years ago, we started a conference in New York City, and I encourage you guys to do the same thing here. And we called it Fit City. And it really was a platform every year to bring the health professionals and bring the people who shape the built environment together in a room like this to have a discussion and to do some workshops to figure out what might be done. This quickly grew into Fit Nation, and more recently has grown into a couple of Fit World conferences in New York and in London, and São Paulo in Brazil has just kick-started. I just got back from their first Fit City conference a couple of months ago. And out of one of the Fit City conferences came a commitment to produce a document called the Active Design Guidelines. And in the nature of collaboration, this was led by 4 key agencies. So design and construction, so basically our public works agency, health and mental hygiene, city planning, and transportation. And what it did was the document drew on all the health evidence and tried to pull out when we had strong evidence, when we had emerging evidence. And a lot of designers had best practices. We didn't have the evidence yet, we're hoping to get it. And we're now encouraging academics to look through this about where we have best practices, but not the evidence. But we do have some evidence, right, that focusing on active transportation, active recreation, and stair use, for example, has a health benefit, right? Taking the stairs can has been shown to increase physical activity. It's been shown to actually reduce people's annual weight gain. So it means that they may not lose weight, but it's good for their heart, right, to be physically active. And when people have more access to active recreation facilities, they're more likely to use it. So, the evidence was building, as I mentioned, but we needed to reach the people who shape the built environment. And that's where the active design guidelines came in. And there's 4 chapters. It's available online, and I can make sure you all have the link. And actually, I'm leaving a copy with Becky in here. But it starts by giving a bit of background on health in the built environment. It talks about urban design strategies, building design, as well as synergies with sustainable and universal design. I'm going to run through pretty quickly. The larger scale, the urban design, starts with thinking about land use mix, right? All the different colours means a different land use, so residential, commercial, community facility. And the idea is once we have a mix of these things, it means we have more amenities, more things that we need as human beings in our daily life within a walking distance. If yellow is residential, a lot of our areas are yellow only, our maps, right? And that means our policies and our land use rules are an impediment to actually promoting mixed-use neighbourhoods. Initially, we separated these land uses many years ago because we had a lot of toxic uses. But today, where our cities aren't dealing with as much industrial uses, they're lighter industrial and they can coexist with residential in cases. So thinking about this mix that promotes walkability, and also thinking about supermarkets and access to fresh food, considering destinations, play areas, plazas, destinations that people have to walk to, making sure that they cater for local age groups and local cultures, and making sure that they're well designed, right? A space that's not well designed is not going to entice anyone to use it. Thinking about the pedestrian environment, how can we calm traffic, right? How do we not have to make the pedestrian a second-class citizen when they want to cross the street? How do we make sure that everyone feels comfortable by calming cars and the movement and creating a safe and attractive environment? Things like providing refuge islands so that an elderly person can cross the street and feel comfortable and not feel intimidated with going out into their city fabric. But also complementing walking spaces with places to rest, and thinking about street cafes and artwork and ways to enliven the pedestrian environment. Now, of course, if we're asking people to think about active transportation, we can use our own 2 feet, but we can also use bicycling. And this is a really fabulous form of transportation without any carbon emissions, of course, and it's good for our health. And in this case, it's really important to keep in mind interconnected, large-scale bikeways, but also promoting wayfinding, and signage and secure bicycle parking. And of course, public transit, right? It's very hard to talk about a lot of these things without also discussing public transit. And this is great because if you think about taking the bus, you might walk 5 or 10 minutes to take that bus, and that 10 minutes is contributing to your daily physical activity needs. You might walk another 10 minutes at the other end. In the building design chapter, what we ask is to think about places to park bicycles within the building, to think about recreational programming. It doesn't have to be expensive. Little bits of paint on a car park can do wonders. We heard a lot that adults with children don't find the time to go to the gym, right? And so thinking about co-locating kids' play areas with adult recreation areas so that they can watch, rather than the kids playing and the adults sitting there and kind of waiting, how can both sets of the community be physically active at the same time? And thinking about stairs, right? How can we make them fun? How can we make them prominent, visually interesting? Thinking about glazing so you can see into staircases so they don't feel intimidating and dark. Can we get natural daylight into them? And how do we design them to entice users, right? As architects, the staircase used to be like the centerpiece of the great piece of architecture, and today it's totally relegated to the back corners. You can't even find the staircase half the time. So how can we, as you guys, as architects, as designers and policymakers, it's not always that more expensive to do this, right? But it's about having these things at the forefront of our consciousness as we're putting pen to paper, as you are drawing up your designs. And putting motivational signage is actually proven. If you put it at the point of decision making, if you put a note saying right next to the elevator button, try taking the stairs. You're not going to reach everyone, but it has been shown to promote increased stair use by 50%. And of course, building exteriors, right? You ask a lot of architects, have you designed sidewalks, you know? And every time an architect is designing a building, you're in fact designing a large portion of the public realm. So how do you think about where your entrances are, the details, the level of transparency, and the rhythm that you're setting up for the people walking past, right? A certain number of people, whether it's a house or whether it's an office building, get to go in a piece of architecture, but way more, many more people experience your building from the outside, from the public realm. And we're not really trained to think about that. So how as architects can we keep that in mind? That vertical rhythm, making features of staircases and this type of thing. And of course, there's a lot of synergies, right, with sustainable and universal design. So making safer places to walk for everybody is actually also really great for people with pushchairs and who need to get around in a wheelchair. We talked a lot with people about the idea of using, people said, well, you can't like move elevators away from staircases because it's not as good for people who need them, right? But the whole point is, everyone we spoke to from the Mayor's Office with Disabilities said, actually, if you can get able-bodied people taking the stairs, that means that the elevators are freed up for the people who actually need it. And so it's actually a really good thing for them as well. And of course, these things are all great for the environment as well, right? When we talk about biking and walking, we're using less energy fuel, we have less air pollution, we're healthier. Take the stairs over the elevator or the escalator, it's less energy. If we're being active outside, we're probably watching less television. And having tap water, safe drinking water, is great, and people are less likely to buy sugar-sweetened beverages, which is unneeded calories. It means savings. It's a reduction in infrastructure costs if we think about compact, walkable developments rather than just thinking about designing roads. It also saves people money in their pockets, right? If we are designing a walkable, transit-friendly environment, people have to put less petrol in their cars, and it's less money out of their pockets. And it's also been shown to provide more jobs when we think about increasing and combining with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. So in New York City, we actually worked to mentor 15 cities from across the United States. And what we did was we brought together transportation, health professionals, and planners and architects together so that they could have the dialogue. So I think, are there any health professionals in the room today? No? Any transportation engineers? No? All right, any architects? All right, so it's going to be your guys' responsibility then to go out and get the health professionals and get the transportation engineers and get everyone in a room to talk about these things together, because you're the ones with the power putting pen to paper, right, and designing the buildings. But you also need to make sure your policymakers are on board, your health professionals I know are going to be on board, and so how do you figure this out as a collective group? Now, out of the active design guidelines has come a huge amount of other follow-up documents. One of them I'm going to speak about in a minute, but everything from looking at active design in affordable housing, and promoting safety, and the shaping the sidewalk experience, which we're actually using this week out in a workshop in Pristina. But you know, it's really, we've started to see change. We've started to see a lot of more recent projects in New York adding on-site gardening with fresh food, adding physical activity equipment in affordable housing. And so it doesn't have to be expensive. You know, through promoting stair use, putting music and art using with communities and getting them to do artwork in the staircases has really been starting to see the changes in practices, which is very exciting. So then, of course, we take a step back and we say, all right, well, it's all very well to have this data, have this evidence, and to put it in a book that says this is how we do design guidelines. But when we think about a city, right, we have to also step back and say, well, what values do all great cities embody, right? We like cities that are diverse, not just one type of people, right? Cities are filled with many different types of people. We have to remember that. We want to foster economic development. We want to foster entrepreneurship. Great cities are about transformation. You guys know this in Christian, right? Things change, they evolve, and they change over time. Some of them through tragic events, some of them through good. Cities, great cities are about the vibrancy of the public realm. They're resilient, they're sustainable, they're safe and active and healthy places. And ultimately, great cities are places for people, right? This is not new. We've heard almost every other speaker this week say this in their talk. So in New York City, with that baseline, we started with our long-term planning goals. And in 2007, our Mayor Bloomberg at the time, released Plan NYC. And Plan NYC said to us in New York City, we're getting 1 million new people by the year 2030. So where are these people going to live, work, play, go to school? So we wanted these overarching principles to guide all of our work. So thinking about a city of opportunity, a sustainable city, a city of neighborhoods, right? Not every neighborhood is unique and different. How do we do comprehensive planning and understand where these significant sites are? Thinking about our assets, about waterfronts and open spaces, and about urban design excellence across every project, no matter what the scale is. How do we not just focus on Manhattan, but actually think about a 5-borough approach where we have different strategic sites throughout the city, where we can think about the neighborhood quality and how we can preserve that in certain cases. Now, with 1 million new people, we certainly do not want 1 million new cars on our road. So one of our biggest things we started with is smart growth, right? Where you see all these lines, all of the areas in light yellow, it's kind of hard to see here actually, but they're within a quarter mile of a radius of a subway station. Half a mile, sorry. So it means that all of our initiatives, we're trying to get near places where people have this opportunity to walk to a grocery store, walk to school, walk to a transit station and not have to have a car. It's not demonizing a car, but giving people an option to use something other than a car. We're trying to think about complete neighborhoods. So where we're thinking about housing, yes, but also jobs and retail and open space all together. And in a way where these are in a walkable scale. Again, so people have the option to get around without having to use a car. Now, how we get there? We start by listening. We start by listening to the community and what they want. We observe. We go out and we draw. We measure. We understand that the tiniest scales sometimes make a huge difference. The height of 10 centimeters, right? The height of a curb. If we don't consider that detail, that means somebody in a wheelchair can't cross the street. Right? So we're not being inclusive in the way we design our city. The angle of a park bench, if it's not right, no one's going to sit there. They might pause, but they're not going to stay for very long. So thinking about these tiny details is critical while we're thinking about this larger scale. We do a lot of models and sketching, and of course discussing and negotiating. And as the slide I put up before, we care about these details. We care passionately about how every building not only touches the sky, but how it touches the sidewalk. And we consider all of the different users that are using our neighbourhoods and our cities. We try and talk and meet with the community members to understand what matters to the locals, what's important to them, and understand that at the table there's many, many different people who shape cities. Architects are one of them, but we are one, right? We are one group of people amongst many. And so everybody has something different at stake. Everybody cares about something different. Someone's passionate about the environment. Someone's passionate about a social program in their neighborhood. Someone else only cares about the budget. Someone else only cares about the deadline. So how do we try and play this negotiation role to make sure all of these different needs are balanced and we can ultimately try and build consensus? The scales we work at, as I mentioned before, start at the larger scale of the whole city. We work a lot at neighborhood scales, understanding the scale of the block, what it means to divide up and have variation within a city block, but also at building, how each building, as I mentioned, touches the ground and touches the sky. And of course, care about the sidewalk. We say we design the sidewalk, or we ask our applicants to design the sidewalk and then design the building. Because otherwise, if you design the building and then you find out you've got 30 centimeters left for a sidewalk, it's kind of a bit of a screw up, right? So we care about street furniture, as I mentioned, at smaller scales, of bollards and angles of bench backs. And what we try and do is we focus on the space, right? With the human being at the center of the space. architects so often are trained and taught, and I can say this because I'm also trained as an architect, but we're often taught to think about shapes and how these shapes go together. And sometimes we kind of forget and kind of put in the person at the very end, and it can be really awkward. So how do we keep the person at the centre of everything we're designing? Now, as the Department of City Planning, we wrote the zoning resolution. Do you guys have zoning here in Pristina? Have something similar, or? Yeah? Okay. So in New York City we have zoning. It's everything, all the rules and regulations that shape land use and the bulk and the envelopes of what can be built on every private property. And we have different tools, right, that we can use to help shape the city and to ask people to change their behaviour or to change policy. And so we can incentivize certain things. We can protect, right? We can not allow something to happen. We can mandate, so we can require something to happen, and in some cases provide a relief with things like floor area. You guys know what floor area is, right? It's the amount of square meterage that you can build on a property. We can set design guidelines, and we can also remove impediments. Our zoning was written 50 years ago, and we design our cities very differently today. So it's critical, as today's professionals working in architecture and policy making, that we're looking at where the impediments exist in the policies that shape our cities. And that you guys as architects are learning a little bit of the basics of these languages, because so often architects are brought in after all these policies have been written and made, right? So they write the policies and they say, oh, okay, now we'll get the architect to design something. But there's a lot of really smart architects as well, and so if you can understand what your tools are in your city and the policies that shape your city, you can have an intelligent dialogue about with the people who shape these to understand how you can create certain environments. Now, some policies make sense to think about a whole city. Some things make sense to think about certain districts within the city. And in some cases, it makes sense to think about a certain building type or a density, right? Like commercial buildings versus residential buildings. Now, a couple of examples. We have a program in New York called FRESH. It's food, retail, expansion to support health. It's a very big mouthful. But what we did was we partnered with our Department of Health, and we did a map of where all the highest rates of obesity and diabetes were in the city. We also made another map where we took where all of the supermarkets were that had fresh food access, and we put them on top of each other, and it was basically a carbon copy. So what that allowed us to do as a city agency was to say, okay, in these districts where we have the highest need, people don't have access to fresh food, we're going to create a district, and if you're a developer and you own a piece of land in that property, you get a discount of your floor area, you get an incentive if you provide a fresh food supermarket for that community, right? So it's a mechanism to incentivize something. It doesn't, fresh food is great, but maybe that's not the problem in Pristina, right? But how do we get smart about thinking where our needs lie and what are our tools to actually address those needs?
What was the incentive piece in this case?
The incentive in this case was two-part. So we partnered with the Health Department and our Economic Development Corporation. The Economic Development Corporation was able to give tax incentives, and as the Department of City Planning, our currency is floor area. So we could say, okay, instead of building 5 stories on this site, you can now build 6 stories. And that means that a developer can build more apartments, which means they can sell them, which means money. So that's kind of how we worked with the incentive in that case. We were also encouraging people to, we wanted to encourage active transportation. So for bicycling, we often saw this around the city. So we said, okay, every new building, multifamily or commercial, now has to put bicycle parking in their building. And we knew that this was going to be a big lift for the developers, the people paying for the building. So we discounted that floor area. So it meant it didn't count towards their floor area. So again, trying to achieve a need through the mechanisms of policy. Now, a lot of New York City actually looks like this. And what we were finding was that our rules, our policies, were shaping buildings and environments like this. Now, it wasn't very nice for the pedestrian, because it meant every couple of meters you were getting interrupted with a curb cut. It meant we couldn't plant trees, and it meant the building facade was incredibly boring because it was a whole series of garages. So we changed the rules to limit the curb cuts throughout the city in these certain districts. So you could still park on the street, but it meant we got a more continuous and safe pedestrian walking environment. Do you guys have car share here? Has anyone heard of car share? Okay, so this is a program that, again, says people need to use cars at times, but not everyone wants to need to use it every day. So we created, there's a lot of programs called Zipcar, and now all the car rental companies are doing it, where cars are parked in a certain place and you have a membership, right? It's like a library, I guess, like a library membership. You go in, you pick up your car, you take it for a few hours and you go back, but you don't have to pay for the maintenance or for parking or for any of the things on the everyday. And so we had an impediment where this was not allowed, and so we removed that impediment in our zoning so that we could allow companies and businesses who ran these car share businesses to start up in the neighbourhoods. We also have something called POPs, right? So these are privately owned public spaces. Has anyone heard of these? No? Okay. So this kind of a really smart idea from the 1960s, and the city said, okay, we are going to incentivize, again, we're going to incentivize, you get a bonus, you can build a bigger building if you provide a public open space, right? The city did not have enough public open space, but at the same time, the city had no money. So they said, okay, well, how do we do this, right? How do we deal with this? We want to change the built environment, we've got no money to do it. So they said to developers, okay, you get a bonus of build a bigger building if you provide a public open space. So it was a great idea. What they kind of forgot to do was put in any design guidelines. So these were the types of spaces we got in the city, and they're not very enticing, and they did not achieve the goal of having more public spaces that people wanted to use. So a couple of years ago, we updated the guidelines and now put in rules around planting and trees and seeding and signage, so that there's still a lot of room for creative design, but the basic ingredients and the fundamentals for quality public open space are there. Now we have more of these destinations throughout the city. I'm sorry? So in these cases, the private property owner is responsible to design, build, and maintain the public open space. We also have in New York City over 500 miles of waterfront. And so a lot of our waterfront areas were old industrial areas, and some of them offered jobs and some of them needed to be ecological areas. And so a couple of years ago we produced a document called Vision 2020, and this was to balance all of these different needs we have in our city. One of them was to expand public access. As I mentioned, a lot of them look like this. And over the years, they've been transformed where the waterfronts now have to be publicly accessible. So if you own a piece of waterfront land, the front 40 feet or the front, say, 15, 16 meters has to be publicly accessible. And we now also have design guidelines for how that has to be designed to ensure that there's trees and benches and that type of thing there. So now a lot of our waterfronts have different types of destinations around the waterfronts. These are some of the examples of the new destinations that have been created in the last decade in New York City with lounge chairs and nighttime destinations, and ideally places where people can bike, get in the water, on the water next to it, and of course we're all going to start swimming to work soon. Now, one document I wanted to jump back to was called Shaping the Sidewalk Experience that I mentioned. And this is, I gave some of the students a much more in-depth presentation on this the other day for our workshop. But this is just to give you a taste. It's also available online and I'll give you the link. But the premise here was that we wanted to set up the idea of a sidewalk room. And this room would have 4 planes, a ground plane. Now the ground plane is the most fundamental. Without it, the sidewalk doesn't exist and nobody has a place to walk. But what we were trying to do is say, the people who design the ground plane are not the only people responsible for shaping the sidewalk experience. You guys as architects and designers, every time you design a building, you're designing at least a quarter, if not half, of that sidewalk experience. So we spend a lot of time looking in plan and section. That's critical, right? We need to understand what these dimensions are. But how do we think in a more spatial and dynamic way? So we had 3 themes of research through this document. And the idea was, how do we think about the human experience? How that experience is shaped not entirely, but in a large amount by the physical space around us, and how that physical space is in turn regulated by a series of policies. So as we walk down the street, we experience a city with all of our senses, right? And we can't control, I can't control if you've just got off a bad phone call. I can't control if the sky is open and it starts thunder and lightning and pouring with rain. But we can control a certain amount of our built environment. And so how do we think about what that is and how do we shape it? So we came up with 6 contributing factors to a great sidewalk experience. And these were thinking about sustainability and resilience, about accessibility for all users, about safety, connectivity, making sure there weren't dead ends, thinking about human scale and complexity. We get very bored easily as human beings. And so how do we make sure we have the texture and variety, continuous variety along our walking experiences? And then what we did was we broke down each of the planes and we tried to identify the series of elements that contribute to the creation of that plane. So the ground plane, the building wall plane, which is defined by the trees and the lighting poles and how closely those are spaced together. It's defined by what's next to the sidewalk. Is it a speeding lane of traffic? Is it a bike lane or is it a parking lane? And only then, once we see through that, the building across the street starts to play a role. The canopy plane changes with season, right? The leaves disappear, in autumn they change colour. In dense areas, the canopy is where taller buildings create a profile against the sky. It's where signage and awnings and things like that hang out over our head. And my favourite, and I'm assuming probably your favourite as a bunch of architects in the room, is the building wall plane. So entrances, how closely they're spaced, the level of transparency, whether there's signage, the details on the columns, how a window comes down and touches its sill. All of these things, the decisions you're making and every time you're putting pen to paper is impacting the walkability and in turn the public health of a community. Now of course when all of these planes come together, we understand that there's a huge number of players, and I don't even know if you can read that, but everyone from the architects and the owner to the person who collects the rubbish from the rubbish bin or the trash can, the person who cleans the street or maintains the bench, the person who puts the planting out in the front. All of these people are responsible. So the intent of this document was to try and broaden the responsibility. And we also then took the series of elements of the 4 planes, pulled the ones that we were responsible for as the planning department and within the zoning, and tried to say, whether it's street trees or green strips, or whether it's rules around ground floor entrances, or levels of transparency, these are things that we're in charge of shaping. Now, I wanted to also mention the High Line. Has anyone here heard of the High Line? Yeah? Has anyone been to the High Line? Awesome. Someone at the back, couple. Great. So this was a project that, for those of you who don't know, it was an old elevated highway that ran through West Chelsea in New York City. And it stopped being used in the 1980s, and it was left abandoned, and seeds off the trains had fallen down and kind of grown into this wild-like landscape. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but a global international design competition was started. 2 guys, Josh and Rob, at a community group kind of went along one day when the city said, we're going to tear down this structure, right? They said, we're going to tear it down. The landowner said, good, tear it down because we can't build bigger buildings. And then this whole group of the Friends of the High Line said, no, please don't tear it down. Let's find a way to keep it. So one of the first members of the Friends of the High Line was my old boss, Amanda Burden. And so she joined us and it became a passionate project of hers. And the reason that it was actually able to work in the end was that we created a district called the Special West Chelsea District, where we said, okay, we're going to allow new residential uses to happen along certain avenues and at the north and south of the site. But in the middle, there's a lot of manufacturing area where the Chelsea Arts District, right, a lot of great little cute galleries existed, and we didn't want those to disappear. So we kept those at a lower height and as non-residential uses. And then we obviously had the Highline corridor. And what we did here is to kind of demonstrate mechanisms that you guys can come up with for your city in Pristina, right? Is we said, okay, now these guys on the side, you can build your new buildings. You have to step back from the Highline. And if you own property here, we're going to create a Highline transfer corridor. And we're going to let you guys sell your rights to the people on the edge. So everybody was happy, right? We got new residential development in a strategic way where we wanted it. The Highline was able to be kept. The building owners around the Highline were happy because they could sell their air rights and make money, and the guys on the side got to build bigger buildings. This is what the district looks like, and an example of how one of those transfers worked. So of course now we have this park in the Skye where you can kind of meander and promenade through the Skye that has catalysed a huge amount of development and brought architects from around the world and really helped to improve the health of the economy, the health of the environment, and the health of the community. Now, very briefly at the end, I just wanted to touch on some of the work that our transportation agency has been doing in New York City. And have you guys heard of Jeanette Sarakan? Anybody? No? Okay. So Jeanette she ran our transportation agency, and she really, I think, transformed transportation engineers, right? Don't always have a good rep. And she's made them like the rock stars of New York City. And so what she did was really try to transform the way people saw their streets. And the story goes, when she was in her interview with the mayor said, you know, Jeanette, why do you want this job? To move cars around the city. She said, I don't want to move cars around the city, I want to move people around the city in whatever different mix of transit that requires. And so how did we think about our cities not only being focused on automobiles, but including people, bringing people back into the discussion? You've probably all seen this slide before, been around the world for a decade, you know, thinking about the different real estate that different modes of transportation use up within our streets. Whether it's a person, whether it's a bicycle, a car, or a bus, and we see for, you know, if the cars have one person in them, they end up taking almost 17.5 times more space than the other modes. So we know we have to fit in. People should always be at top, right? It's time to shift our hierarchy upside down and shift from designing cities for cars to designing cities for people, and making sure that designing cities for people means having great bicycle networks. It means having green infrastructure and trees. And yes, it means having travel lanes and parking and public transit. But each street, we need to understand what's the hierarchy of these modes. And really the top 3 should never go too far to the left. So we have our streets, which are our most fundamental form of public open space. But we have limited space, right, from building front to building front. So we can't afford to give that all away to one mode of transport. So it's a big challenge in a lot of cities, but we're seeing some really incredible examples now about providing choices of modes of transit. Now, of course, our Department of Transportation also maintains all the streets and roads and bridges and tunnels, but they really, in the last administration, took a big effort to produce publications and think creatively about the streets. So you want to be to Times Square? Couple people? Yeah. So Times Square, I don't know if you saw it, but it was like this, or more recently, but Times Square, almost 90% of the road space was for vehicles. It's one of the busiest spaces in the city, and Jeanette said, all right, we're going to close this to cars, and everyone said, you are crazy. Like, you can't close the busiest intersection in the world to cars. She said, well, let's try it. Right? Let's give it a go. We'll try it. If it doesn't work, we'll take it, we'll shift it back. And of course, they transformed it temporarily. They were able to kind of invert the hierarchy. And now, at the moment, this has then been able to shift into, with capital funding, into a permanent closure. Now the thing that they did was they collected a lot of statistics in that year, and they said, you know what, and I know you guys probably did a similar thing with your Mother Teresa here, which is a fabulous example. They collected data, so they said, we'll close it temporarily, and they were able to show that injuries went down, traffic actually moved more smoothly, all the businesses did better, everybody loved it, they preferred it, and so they were able to do it in a permanent way. And this is not just happening in Times Square, but in other parts of the city, as well as through a formal plaza program where community groups in all of the 5 boroughs of New York can apply. So not just in Manhattan, but they can apply to partner with the city, and they maintain the spaces. The city will give them the roadbed, they gift up the land, and then the community group maintains the space and comes up with the design. Now in terms of bicycles, of course, New York City used to be like this, right? It was only the guys in Lycra, and everyone said, we looked at Copenhagen, and we said, oh, we're never going to get the grandmas and the little kids in these kind of big traffic jams of bicycles. But they thought they'd start. So they started by, with the bicycle network for the whole city, and more than doubling that, and thinking about the different types of bicycle lanes. Sometimes we had narrow streets, so we had to try and adjust the way we could, how we could fit the bike lanes in. But we've started to see a transformation not only in the streets, but in certain corridors along the waterfront, and trying to design in safe connections and interface between the different modes of transportation. And you know, really by providing the infrastructure, we're then providing a space that is inviting, and young children and adults are more likely to use it. We got our bike share programs, so similar to the car share. You have a membership, and you can hop on a bike and move, take it for 30 minutes, 40 minutes. It's been incredible. It's really such a fabulous way to get around the city, and been incredibly popular. We also have a program, Street Seats, where people started to say, so businesses, if you take away parking, businesses often go, oh my God, my business is going to go out of business. And so what they did was the city said, all right, well, here's a program. We're not going to make you do it. You don't have to do anything, but you can apply to this program, right? And businesses started to see that instead of having, 3 cars with no people in it outside their business, they could actually fit, a bunch of tables. And hey, all of these people sitting at the tables are going to come in and buy a coffee at my store and maybe buy some lunch. So these spaces, now business owners can apply. The city, again, gifts the land, and the business owners build, maintain, erect, and actually they have to make it open to the public. So there's a sign that it's not only they can't kick public people out of the seating, it's for everyone in the community. So again, it's not a requirement, but thinking about the mechanisms we have to allow something like that. There's also a lot of work done on wayfinding, thinking about how we let people know how to get around the city, but also adding walkable distances so that people understand. It's very faint, but you might see this yellow line that says, this is a 5-minute walk, so you don't need to hop in a car or anything. And we talked about seating earlier. With an aging population, and I know you guys in Pristina actually have one of the youngest populations in the world, but people are aging, whether we like it or not. And as we age, being physically active is very critical, but maybe not always as easy. And so elderly people are more likely to leave their home and take a walk around the block if they know they've got somewhere to sit down every block. So we've now introduced a new city bench program in New York City, where again businesses can call up and ask for one to be put outside their business. We also have a lot of programs to try and help transform the way that people experience their cities. So we have summer streets where we close a huge stretch, a couple of times a year on the weekends, and we have swimming pools and dumpsters and yoga classes, and people can bike the whole stretch. And it's really important to getting people out and experiencing their city in a way that they didn't realize that they could, and what the street meant. Now this document is online. If anyone wants to download it, it's called Measuring the Street. And as I mentioned, DOT has done a lot of great work with all these changes within the public right-of-way, but they've also been collecting the data. And so this is now showing that speeding has decreased, injuries have gone down, businesses have done better, vacancies, there's less vacancies, 74% of the users prefer the new area, 172% increase in retail sales. And same as a lot of the safety statistics, as I mentioned. So in the last kind of 10 years or so, there's been a reduction in traffic fatalities, actually less people getting their vehicle registrations, and an overall drop in traffic volumes. We've also done a lot of work in select bus service and making that a more popular mode of transportation to get around the city, and there's been almost a 300% increase in cycling. So for you guys, I think in Pristina, you've got some incredible examples where you're already demonstrating some really great spaces for people in the city. I know I've only been here for a few days, but just in walking around in our workshops. So I think it's great, right? There's something to start from. Of course, you've got a lot of these really interesting and fascinating and historically important monuments throughout the city that have a huge amount of potential, as well as thinking about some of the pieces of infrastructure, you know, about old pieces of rail. I have no idea where this goes, but we stumbled across it on a walk the other day. If this is continuous, can we think about opportunities for spaces like this? But there's also a lot of challenges, right? Half the sidewalks, many of the sidewalks are crumbled and not really accessible for people, or they're covered in car parks, where people can't even safely walk down the sidewalk. Just this afternoon, actually, I saw this poor old lady with a walking cane trying to get down the street. So there's a lot of resources out there, and this is some of the work that we're working with in the workshop this week. There's a great publication called NACTO, if anyone's interested, with an urban street design guide where we start to understand intersections like this where we've designed them around the cars, and how do we transform these to shorten crossing distances, to add trees, to add green, to make it a more enticing environment for everybody to use the public space of the streets. And sometimes these really don't need to cost a lot of money, but they can be temporary measures. And so all of these resources, I hope both the NACTO, but also the Shaping the Sidewalk Experience documents can be helpful. So you guys keep in mind that your general approach, no matter what you're doing, what you're designing, whatever scale, that you always judge from Pristina's pedestrian perspective. And I think you guys are the agents of change, so I'm really excited to come back here in a few years to see the progress, and thanks again for having me. And I'll leave these documents.
Thank you, Skye, for a very inspiring presentation and showing us some of great examples of what we can do with little effort. So we will start a session of questions and answers.
Hi, my name is Ilya. I'm one of the teachers here at the Urban Planning Department. I just wanted to let you know that the measurements and the research on the traffic, pedestrian and parking for the Mother Teresa Street was done by the students of these universities, led by their teachers. I think Nod is one of them from 2003.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay, hi, my name is Viola.
Can you wave again? Oh, there you go.
Should I speak more?
Yes, please.
Okay. In fact, one of the examples that you showed us, like I had a key example in one of my urban landscape. So, like, my first question was like, for example, you try to achieve like landscape in between, like in such a dynamic city. So, when we were trying to do such things back in my school, we had like all those like concerns and problems, like how to achieve like that kind of scale of like such a dynamic apartments, like how we have like roller coaster and all those skyscrapers in between with a like landscape like layout. So for example, how did you try to achieve like the unity between all those dynamic skyscrapers and all the people? Like how would they feel comfortable in such a layout?
I think I understand what you're saying. as I mentioned before, what we try, so part of our job is, at the Department of City Planning, is projects come in to get approved, right? So part of our job is when a project comes in, we enter a negotiation process where someone might say we want a taller building, or we want a different land use, and then we're able to have a negotiation process with them. And what we ask for every time is how, as I mentioned, how buildings touch the sky and how they touch the sidewalk. So if we get a building that comes in and we don't think it's doing a good job at touching the sidewalk, then we sit there and we have design charrettes with them, and we count the number of entrances, and we look at the level of transparency, and we go to site, and you can talk to some of the students who are out sketching this week, but we go and we sketch from the perspective of a pedestrian, of someone standing on the sidewalk, and we put the proposal in there and see what we think it's going to feel like. I don't know about you guys, I don't get to fly in a helicopter very often, right? But it's kind of the way that we do all of these designs. It's from this magical world. So we try and use that way of asking for drawings of those specific parts of the buildings in more detail. And by asking for them, we then kind of force the architects and designers to think about it. And they're often actually really excited and supportive of that process, because often they've been told by developers, like, no, don't spend money on that. We don't want you to think about that.
Okay, what about the sidewalks? We saw that how everything was designed for the sidewalk, and basically, like, in all the examples that I saw, there is no semi-open spaces under the benches. So we have an example here in Mother Teresa Square, and basically most of the benches are not used because there is no semi-open spaces. So how...
Sorry, what do you mean by a semi-open space?
Like let's say like canopies, like something like shading that makes people comfortable sitting under the sun.
Yeah.
So what would be, do you have any like suggestion for our square, like having such like opening, like or shade of spaces?
We typically use trees. I think this is a really critical thing for you guys here with the climate. It's pretty hot here, and also it's very hot in New York City. And whatever context we're working in, right, by bringing it back to the basic principle of a city for people, we're then able to take on the nuances of each place, right? So you go to Montreal, for example, and they've got ridiculous snow loads, and that brings up a whole series of issues with the sidewalks. For shading devices, it's not waterproof, but planting trees is one of the great mechanisms, because you get both the shade from the sun, you get the green and the cleaning of the air, and the visual green, which has been proven to improve mental health by having exposure to literally kind of green planting and landscape. So I think you've got trees in certain cases. Maybe you want to look at areas where there's a design competition for a little shading device or something that could be in some of the areas down the street.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you about this project, Highline, and you told us that you brought from all around the world the architects, or I understood like star architects. It was seen Frank Gehry, Jean Webb, etc. Is it still in New York, is my experience? Or did you change something about opportunities for the young architects doing projects or competition, or is still very controlled by established offices?
There are some efforts to the Department of Design and Construction, our Public Works Office. They've got a design excellence program, and what they do is they have this, it's kind of like a process where you apply, and you're on this kind of short list of teams, so that when a project comes up, they don't have to vet the process of that architecture team. So there's a lot of new young architects who are getting onto these lists, where public works, like city projects, can pull from that body of architects. Pipo was presenting the other night, I don't know if you were here, presenting the projects at the Maxi Museum in Rome. So there's a similar young architects program in New York City, and they do a competition every year and do the PS1. It's like basically a big dance party under a big infrastructure. Yeah. Yeah, I think we could do a better job, personally. Yeah, no, I agree. Any other questions? Yeah.
explain us more about the zoning? Because in new spatial planning law, we have the zoning, we change from urban regulatory plans to zoning. And if you could explain for our audience a little bit more what zoning includes.
Sure.
Thank you.
So zoning is it's a very complicated, powerful yet blunt tool. So the zoning, basically every single piece of property in the city, in New York City, has zoning that shapes, that says this is what you're allowed to do. And what zoning covers is land use, so the type of, if I can do residential, if I'm allowed to, or if I have to put commercial uses, if I'm allowed to mix industrial and residential uses. And so that's created by a letter, right, called R for residential or C for commercial. And then there's a number, and that number relates to the density, so that the amount of square footage or square meterage, or for what we call FAR, the amount of floor area you're allowed to build. So you have an FAR, like a number. You have a land use, an allowable land use, which is subdivided into all these use groups. And then you have what we call our Vulcan envelope controls. And those are the things that, if you think about it like a lump of Play-Doh, right? And this represents the floor area that you're allowed to build on your site. Now the bulk and envelope controls basically say your building has to sit on the street wall, has to come up, but then it has to sit back. So we squeeze that volume back a little bit. And then maybe it has to sit back over here, or it has to have a side yard, and so that goes up. So that's the very basic form, is the bulk and envelope, the FAR, and the land use. And then there's a whole series of nuances where, in certain cases, we're then able to control things like entrances and curb cuts and transparency levels and signage and permitted obstructions, whether you can put wind turbines on your roof, facade depths and shading devices. So it gets very, very complicated. Our zoning is basically 3 big fat black folders about this fat. But it's a lot of black and white text, and when I'm not trained as a policymaker, I'm trained as an architect. To me, it was like reading Russian or Albanian, or I really didn't. It's like a foreign language kind of. But as you try and get into it, I think it's really important that designers who are interested in shaping the city at least learn a bit of the basics of that, so that they can actually be at the policy-making, decision-making tables in certain cases.
Keni edhe ndonjë pyetje? Atëherë bëjmë një pauzë për 10 minuta dhe vazhdojmë